Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this webinar in our series, Data Science in the News. The series is convened by the QUT Centre for Data Science and the Queensland Academy of the Arts and Sciences. I'm Kerrie Mengersen. I'm a Distinguished Professor of Statistics and a member of the Centre for Data Science at QUT, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the land where QUT now stands, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country from where you're joining us today. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. So today we're going to talk about extreme data science. So there's many areas in our world and our society that are becoming more extreme. Our climate, our social issues, our politics, our science. Data and data science touches each of these areas. And data science itself is also becoming more extreme with respect to the flood of data available from an increasing variety of sources, from satellites to social media, from our wearables to our own genes. But conversely, in many areas, there's not a flood, but there's actually a drought of data, where data are expensive and scarce. So today, we're going to talk to data scientists from the QUT Centre for Data Science who are working at these extremes, either extremes in their applications or extremes in the data and data science itself. The five panellists are Associate Professor Kate Helmstedt, Dr. Brodie Lawson, Associate Professor Paul Wu, Dr. Aiden Price, and Professor Divya Mehta. I'm going to introduce each of these panellists in turn, and I'm going to ask them to speak to a topic that's related to the theme of the webinar for about 5 minutes or so. And then after each of them have spoken, we'll follow this with a group discussion. So if you have a question for the panel members, please put them in the chat, and time permitting, we can answer these and include them in the discussion. So let's start. Our first panel member is Associate Professor Kate Helmstedt. So Kate's research is focused on developing mathematical and data science methods to help understand and protect ecosystems and species. And her work draws on expertise in operations research, decision science, mathematical modelling, and mathematical ecology. She leads the QUT Applied Mathematical Ecology Group, a group of around 30 academics, postdocs, and students using maths and data science to tackle extreme questions about ecological systems. So Kate works in threatened ecosystems, including Antarctica, Great Barrier Reef, and areas where biodiversity is under threat from agriculture and land clearing. And today, Kate's going to talk about macroscopic environments, safeguarding one of the most extreme environments on Earth, the Antarctic. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Kerrie. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about the extreme end of the Earth. So how mathematics and data science can help us to protect ecosystems very, very far away, somewhere where many of us are never going to see, and that's Antarctica. So before becoming apparently a data science expert in Antarctica, I knew very little about Antarctica. And so if you're in that same boat, Antarctica is massive. So it's kind of twice the size of Australia. Most of it has never been visited by anyone, which means that most of that continent we have almost no information about. And so really my work is sitting in that area that Kerrie was talking about, where in a world where we're used to having a lot of data coming in, actually what we have to deal with is we have a lot of data coming from things like satellites, but very little data that's actually on the ground telling us about those systems. But at the exact same time, the ecosystem, so we're thinking about the penguins, but also things that we know a little bit less about, like the mosses and the invertebrates that live down there. We're thinking about trying to protect these ecosystems while they're under this massive amount of threat. and the threats are largely coming from people and from climate change. And so really these threats are rapidly increasing, but our data is not necessarily rapidly increasing at the exact same time. So we're in this situation where we need to look at the types of data science and decision science approaches that we can develop in order to be able to say, look, we know there's all of this complexity and uncertainty in this ecosystem, but at the same time, we cannot allow that to stymie our progress, and we can't allow ourselves to be frozen in indecision. And what that means is this really exciting time for applying data science and decision science in that system, where we can say, okay, we've sort of developed a lot of these methods for dealing with high uncertainty, dealing with patchy data, or dealing with kind of downscaling large scale remote sensed data. We've developed all of these statistical and data science approaches in other systems, and now we're looking at what does it mean to pull those in and use those types of questions that have been developed for many years in other places in this really critical ecosystem right now very rapidly. And so when we think about protecting Antarctica, there's a few different ways that it's very complex down there. So first of all, yes, we're working in a system where we have very little information and a lot of uncertainty about those systems. And so we need to look at the types of information and data that we have, this spatial data that we're getting about where species are, for example, and be looking at the biases that might be existing in this data. So we do a lot of bias quantification and kind of bias correction in the data that we look at, because when we send someone down to Antarctica, which is a very expensive endeavor, very expensive, takes a long time to get there. Not everyone can go and collect data in Antarctica. It means we get it in very specific places, and it tends to be sort of clustered around same areas. So it means we need to use data science approaches to really understand what is it to take that we know biased data that we can't fix with increasing field work, and try and analyze what does it mean to layer that in with other environmental variables, like where is the ice, what are the temperatures like, how does wind affect water provision in Antarctica, and kind of say, okay, how can we use statistical data science approaches to then remove the bias from that data? But Antarctica is not managing Antarctic ecosystems are not just about the species. The other really extreme part, I think, about the work that we do in Antarctica is thinking there's also a very complicated governance system of Antarctica. So if we thought about like managing a threatened species or a threatened ecosystem in Australia, you got to think about what the state government or the federal government might do, and maybe we want to kind of give them the best information that we can so that they make the right decisions. Antarctica is a global commons, though. No one really has just complete control over Antarctica, and it's a lot of different countries needing to negotiate in order to get any type of management through a political system in Antarctica. And so the other really important part where we don't have a lot of data, but we're trying to make decisions, is in looking at these kind of thinking of these geopolitical relationships a little bit like a social network, and trying to borrow the data science and decision science approaches from social network analysis or other types of network analysis to understand how can we try and understand how decisions are made in this complicated social network, but also how might we be able to think about trying to get better decisions met through in that system? How do we try and get a really complicated political system like that to try and do things like protect emperor penguins when it might not necessarily be in everyone's primary interest? So there's all these places where we look at the problem, we try and describe the problem in a language from mathematics and data science that we know that we can answer, so that we can then pivot it to use draw from a bunch of different type of mathematical and data science approaches, so we can answer these types of questions. I think it's a really fascinating field where really we're not driven by knowing a very specific data science approach. What we're driven by is this question is emerging. It cannot be solved without data science approaches. So how do we look out into the types of things we need to do and draw what we need to? I think that's a really exciting place to be doing this type of data science and mathematics, where we're really constantly sort of doing this detective work to understand and match the types of approaches that we know either we or our friends or our collaborators from the real depths of that methodological development can get together and be really helpful in order to answer these really pressing questions so that we can kind of protect this massive extreme, this global extreme that we all really care about. Thanks, Kerrie.
Thank you so much. That was great, Kate. What a great start to the session. It was really, really interesting, and we can understand really how challenging it is and how broad it is too. Our second panelist is Dr. Brodie Lawson. So Brodie is a postdoctoral researcher in applied mathematics, working with the QUT Centre for Data Science and the ARC Centre of Excellence for Plant Success in Nature and Agriculture. Brodie's primary research interest is interfacing simulation science and statistics in order to better understand issues of sensitivity and variability in complex systems. A bulk of his previous work was directed towards electrical signalling in the heart, where intricate travelling wave dynamics govern both the healthy heartbeat and its degeneration into different forms of dangerous arrhythmia. Now he's working with plants. And so Brodie is going to talk to us about extremely expensive data, why studying the heart is important, but data is scarce, and how this can be overcome, and how hearts are related to plants, where things might be expected to be easier with respect to extreme data, but in fact, they aren't. So Brodie, tell us why.
Yeah, sure thing. So the expensive is really the key word there. And as Kerrie said before, expensive also means scarce. And I think that's sort of really what we're talking about. And the heart is kind of both at once in that it's really well understood. You've got all these great mathematical formulas that describe all the electrical signaling going on in there, and it's electrical signaling that makes it beat. And it's when that electrical signaling goes wrong that you get things like, yeah, arrhythmia. Um, and one of the really tricky things about it is that it's really different between people, and it makes it very hard to understand when you may have a problem or when you may not. And so, yes, we have, uh, you know, heart disease being one of the sort of greatest health challenges and getting worse. You also have difficulties treating it because you can have drugs that will say, oh, we want to get rid of arrhythmia. Okay, let's give it an antiarrhythmic drug, and then our antiarrhythmic drug actually causes arrhythmia of a different kind in some group of people. So understanding this variability from person to person has been a sort of very interesting statistical problem space to sort of live in. And to understand that, we need so much more data because now we don't just need data about what does a heart do. We can't just go and measure somebody's ECG or dig in a bit deeper where the data gets harder to get. That's where it gets expensive when you're looking at individual cells or some other things we'll talk about in a little bit. Yeah, when you need to dig into that finer scale, you need data now, not just for that, but now you need how does that vary across people? So you've got to collect it for lots and lots of people when it's already hard to collect. Some of this is sort of like, oh, I've got single cells that were taken from a little scraping during a heart transplant type thing. It's not easy to get. And so if we don't have that data, one of the things that you could view some of the things that we've done with the Center for Data Science is to sort of create fake data. And so without getting technical about all of what we're looking at here, we have essentially what we've created is a virtual population of heart cells. So every little line on the graph is an individual cell. We've created a healthy population and a population that has atrial fibrillation. And that is created by saying, okay, I need to use statistics that can handle the fact that everybody is different. And so a lot of methods are out there to say, oh, I want my model to match my data. How do I do that? But it gets a bit different when I want a whole population of models to match a population's worth of data. So there's some interesting statistics there. But what we can do once we have a virtual population is say, oh, well, let's give them a drug treatment and see what happens. And so the red was unhealthy, the blue was healthy. When we treat people, the gold pushes it back to look a bit more like a blue shape and a bit longer, which you'll just take my word for it is good for protecting against arrhythmia. But if you can see here, there's a few lines here where the gold lines have actually fallen down and done something completely different. And so that's where we're now saying, oh, okay, from our methods, we can identify the individuals where something may be going wrong, where we need to look a bit more. In the interest of time, I'll kind of go through it quite quickly. But one of the other really interesting things was when you go to an even further microscopic level. And so this is where you take histology. And so this is like an invasive procedure where you, again, are like cutting off small amounts of tissue and then you're staining it to look at where the blockages are that are stopping the signaling from getting through. And that's not widely available. And so what we did was we looked at, can we generate more examples of the type of patterning for these different types of fibrosis, which is what you call it when you have those blockages for conduction? Can we create these generated images that are synthetic versions so that we can try lots of different people who have similar disease conditions but different realizations of it? How does that affect them? And that has then gone on to people who are using that generator in their studies to look at that. And so, yeah, just for the last part, I wanted to talk about after that, when I moved to the ARC Centre for Plant Success, and we were, still working with the Centre for Data Science. I was originally thinking that would be a bit easier because the heart was very complicated, and you think about a human being versus a plant, and you feel like there's a difference, a sort of level of complexity there. But it turned out not so simple. It turns out that you can think about plants, they grow towards the sun, but then they do all these other fascinating things, like you've got plants that will climb up things, you've got all of the things like Venus flytraps. But even just on the most basic level, the basic plant, they have hormones and they do all the same signaling that a human body does to tell it like when to produce a branch. Like all of this is actually defined by hormonal processes in the plant. And so they have a lot of the same complexities. It turns out that like everyone's favorite model plant in science has more protein coding genes than humans do, which was a big surprise for me at least, maybe because biology is not my area. And the last thing is just the experiments are very, very variable because when you're growing plants and you have to grow them to a certain, extent of growth, you need to control the conditions really, really carefully because they're really good at adapting to their environment. If the environment isn't constant, you're going to get different results every time. And so what that ended up resulting in is the challenge that I've seen working with biologists in the plant center is their data. It's not only expensive because it takes a long time to grow a plant in that sense, their data is of a sort of different quality where they just want to say, well, this plant branched a lot, this one didn't branch that much. And they're not measuring numbers. It's not like branch length necessarily, because that's too variable across all the experiments. So you just have to cut things into boxes. And then we need to do calibration methods where we say, oh, that's a red, that's a blue. Can we get our model to just be a red or a blue in the right way? And that was also then, okay, we need to use some different statistical techniques because we don't have numbers to match to numbers, which is what a lot of data science becomes when you boil it all down. So yeah, that was sort of like an interesting problem that was coming from the sort of different nature of this data. And I feel like that's probably my time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brodie. There's so much there that we could unpack, and it's very, very interesting. It's a really interesting insight into two very different areas, but then how there's this commonality between them. Our next speaker is going to be Associate Professor Paul Wu. So Paul is a member of the School of Mathematical Sciences at QUT and the Centre for Data Science. And he's an industry research fellow funded by the Australian Institute for Sport and the Queensland Academy of Sport. Paul's interested in developing and applying advanced statistical methods and algorithms to understand and make predictions about complex systems. He's also passionate about their application in partnership with industry, with contributions not only in sport, but also in ecology and airports. But today, Paul's going to talk to us about something that's coming up in the future and we're all excited about, the 2032 Olympics and Paralympics and beyond. And what does extreme data science have to do with those? Paul, over to you.
So yeah, it's the extreme side of sports, the elite sports, and the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games, and how data science can be applied to this. So I'm sharing a bit of what a fairly substantial teams of collaborators, researchers, students, industry partners have been working on. And I just wanted to give you two little snippets of where data science can come into play. The first one is how fast is fast enough to win gold, uh, or to get a medal, or to even qualify for the finals. So in this particular example I'm talking about, it's some work we did with Swimming Australia and the Queensland Academy of Sport. It was predicting future winning times using race results. And we've done some similar things in other sports like sprint kayak, triathlon, and are doing in running. The general trend, as everybody knows, is that athletes tend to get faster. And you might think, well, why don't I just use the time that they used to win last year or the last Olympics as my target? But in elite sports, where a fraction of a second can determine the winner or the third place or even missing out on qualifying. So for instance, here we're looking at men's 50 meters freestyle, where we had that great gold medal from Kay McAvoy at the Paris Olympics last year. That was in 21.25 seconds. But there's only a fraction of a second between first place and third, and only another fraction more to miss out on the finals altogether. So we've been developing Bayesian models, or type of statistical model that can use kind of what happened in the last Olympics, what happened in the past three major events, and to be able to characterize the uncertainty around that. And that's quite important because trying to predict the exact time is extremely difficult, if really only possible if you have a crystal ball. So what we can do, though, is characterize what is the chance of winning if you were able to swim a certain time. And that's useful for selectors, for coaches, and athletes. How did we do in Paris last year? So we're just looking at here all the different events by men and women, and looking at the kind of the probability range for the different times of the different events. For the 7 events, there was about 25% chance of what the final winning time was of happening or faster, and 5 for 25% chance of that time was slower. But 13 events were more or less as expected, and with one unexpected result, where it was actually a much slower event than. And so what happened is we were working closely with our industry partners for that they could go back and forth, back to the national coach, to the end users. And then this can then contribute to our teams in their preparation for these major events. Changing gears a little bit, another example of work that I've been doing in elite sport has been in injury analysis. So this was work with Australian Institute of Sport, West Coast Eagles, and across QUT and UNSW, looking at predominantly AFL and injuries in that sport, but also with Bundesliga data. Why is this of interest? 40 to 60% of athletes sustain injury in a season, and 15 to 45% can get subsequent injuries. So you have that initial injury, and then you get a second injury. It's a little bit worse, takes a little bit longer to recover from, then another one, and so on. And the aim of the game is to try to stop, to prevent subsequent injuries. And basically, you want to train as hard as possible while minimizing injury risk. Now, this, like in many other examples, there's a strong application in elite sport, but it absolutely applies, especially with the proliferation of the necessary wearable technologies to community sport and the general population. So what were we doing here? We were trying to better understand the risk of injury and how that risk might change with state. So it's kind of imagine like how do you feel? So somebody who's just coming back for an injury in a different type of state than somebody who's healthy, somebody who's been overworked over time, they're in a more susceptible state to injury. So that means you can use things like the severity of the last injury, see here, along with psychological measures like the rating of perceived exertion and wearable sensors from every single training and game session, such as the change of speed, how fast you run, how much you run, and to try to estimate then the risk of injury. And we were able to achieve this with about 77% sensitivity, which means that 77% of the time when there is an injury, we were able to predict that. So that's just a bit of a snippet of where some of the extreme data science and extreme sports can match up, and it's kind of trying to take things to the next level, which is important in a competitive world, but also important for the health and fitness of the general population.
Thanks very much, Paul. What a great insight into this very exciting area of sports analytics. Something that Australia has great strength in, and we're leading the world in, and obviously you're one of the world leaders in that area. So thank you for sharing that. We're going to now introduce Dr. Aiden Price. So Aiden works as a research associate in our Centre for Data Science, and he's the project manager on the AusEn Health project. So this is a national environmental health strategic planning digital twin. So it's looking at how the environment might affect our health and using data to build a sort of twin of that, or a replica of that natural and health system. So Aiden's research is currently focused on spatial and temporal analyses of environmental and population health data. For example, identifying the impact of bushfires on human health. And is also interested in conservation-focused work through the lens of aesthetics in the Antarctic Peninsula, working with Kate. But today he's going to take us on a different journey, and he's going to talk about deep weather and floods, something that we here in Brisbane are very interested in. So, to you, Aiden.
Thanks, Kerrie. I thought that floods would be a perfect topic for extreme data science because the term extreme can be used to describe floods in quite a few different ways. Thinking about the impact of floods, both economically and on human lives, the variability of floods being quite extreme, but also the lengths that we've got to go to prepare towns, cities, and communities for flood events have to be quite extreme. I think at the moment, under every climate scenario released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we're now set to experience increased frequency and intensity of storms year on year, which just puts populations more at risk. We've already seen in Brisbane these events happening more and more frequently over the past decade as well. And that's in part because of our population growth, our urban developments, all the pressures that are added to our runoff systems that change how floods move through regions. So my work in floods started because of a digital mud army, which was an event held at QUT in March of 2022, which Associate Professor Kate Helmstedt helped to run. Researchers gathered at this event to explore how data-driven models, maps, and visualizations can improve or better support communities with more actionable warnings for future flood events. I think some of the things they explored were flood extent uncertainty and changes over time, crowdsourced data from Twitter, which included spotlighting of road closures and other diversions, and then changes in flood extents from previous events, interactive maps, and one, I guess, in particular there is improvements over some of the pixelated flood extent maps that were produced by the council at the time. And in fact, one of the members that were on our team for this event, the flood line was right on the border of their house, but they couldn't see whether it was covering or not because their household was underneath one of the region labels that was on the PDF. So by having an interactive map and being able to zoom in, clearly you can improve situations like that. The team that I joined was working on flood vulnerability and community flood vulnerability. And the idea there is to pair flood extent maps with population demographics and service locations so that you can better understand which populations are more susceptible and resilient to flood events based on where they live and their life circumstances, as opposed to just how much water's in their house. And another example there, again, from our team, is that one of our members wasn't touched at all by water during the flood events in 2022, but they were without power for weeks during and after the event. So even though their property wasn't directly impacted, their life was certainly impacted. So the way we work with that data is by combining it together with different weights using a method known as principal components analysis, essentially just a way of combining lots of different pieces of information into a easy to understand score. And that was used to create what we call the Flood Vulnerability Index, which we use to map out and show how communities are more likely to struggle during and after a flood event, even if the water didn't touch their house. We worked with that product with stakeholders like Red Cross, the Queensland Reconstruction Authority and Queensland Fire Department, and also the Office of the Inspector General for Emergency Management to look at things like awareness campaigns or deployment strategies for personnel and resources, and also for the sake of the Reconstruction Authority, things like repairs and town planning that could be better improved for future flood events. Now I'm exploring how services are impacted by a flood event. So before we were talking about where services might be to support communities during and after flood events, but they're also directly impacted based on their location and based on the floods as well. And that kind of thing just further restricts communities during and after flood events, even after the water is receded, because those services are still inundated or unable to be reopened because of resourcing. Then communities can't access things like their schools or businesses, food services, things like that. So this research was funded by the Centre for Data Science's First Bite grant program. We use that funding to compile a few different data sets. One is the location of households, another location of services like schools, hospitals, emergency services, grocery stores. And then we determined how accessible each type of service was from each household in Queensland. And then using Brisbane-specific flood extent maps, we could determine the impact of that service accessibility both in 2011 and 2022, including instances where houses were completely inundated, where we could flag them separately from just houses who had an impacted service access score. And now, again, back to extremes, we're looking at pretty extreme statistical models to explore the differences in service impacts between events. We're looking at things like communities that are experiencing most significant flood impacts, overlap between high delays in food or health service access and low socioeconomic communities. And the models that we're using here have to be complex because we're capturing such a wide variety of data types, including the 600,000 odd homes that are in these population regions in the Brisbane area. Population level data like income, unemployment, family size, household age, and considering uncertainty around when and why those households are inundated in the first place, whether it's the type of flood event, whether it's due to runoff, things like that. And for time's sake, I might wrap it up there. I'm excited to explore how advanced data can support that work, things like flood models, which add uncertainty rather than just using pure flood extents. But also other emerging data sources like mobility data, which might help us to better understand where people are able to move in a flood event and even after that flood event. But I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Aiden. It's really, really interesting and really important work. And it's great to see the collaboration. Kudos to Kate as well for leading this investigation and to both of you for doing such great work in this area. I'm going to now call on our last speaker, Professor Divya Mehta. So Divya is a geneticist and a biostatistician, and she co-leads the sports systems and AI domain in the Centre for Data Science at QUT, and she's a group leader in stress genomics at QUT. And she focuses on the identification of risk and protective factors for health and well-being in humans, with a focus on the drivers and the buffers of stress and stress-related disorders across different groups, including athletes, emergency responders, and veterans. So I can't think of anybody better to be talking about this topic of deep brains, so psychiatric genetics, as another extreme area of science, and what's data got to do with it. So Divya is going to talk about how different kinds of data are integrated using different methods to better understand how our brains work and to be able to identify these drivers of psychiatric genetic orders such as depression. Divya, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. So deep brains. Brains are very complex. And just as I'm talking to you and you're listening to me, there's about 86 billion neurons that are firing in both our brains. And when we think about psychiatric genetics, we've got data from more than millions and millions of people all across the world. Still, there's so much we still cannot understand about psychiatric disorders and brain disorders in general. And one of the reasons for that is that mental health outcomes are highly variable. So there's a whole range of different factors that can drive why some person would get depression or PTSD when you face a particular stressful event, whereas other people could remain resilient and not have any mental health disorder. So what we do in our group, in the stress genomics group, is trying to understand these drivers of mental health. So looking at psychosocial factors, but as well as the biological factors, things such as genes. And in psychiatric genomics, we've got huge amounts of data. So here's a review that we had done a couple of years ago, just showing the different layers of data that we look at. So we've got genomics data, which is the genetic variants. This is the fixed DNA component that does not change. And then we've got the dynamic part of our genes. So things like gene expression, transcriptomics, epigenetics, metabolomics, metagenomics, etc. So you've got these different layers of complexity in our brain that we're looking at, and different layers of genes and environmental factors that can interact to drive health. Of course, it's very difficult to get brain samples from people. So what we need to do in psychiatric genetics is to be innovative. So the way we do this is looking at different populations, but we also look at cell lines and organoids. So these are brain-derived cells that we can obtain, and we can run these in labs, run them in a Petri dish, stress them out, give them different kinds of interventions, treatments, and see how these respond. So we've got these kind of brains in a dish, as well as different people looking at animal models of stress and psychiatric disorders, looking at mice, rats, etc. The kind of methods that we use in psychiatric genetics are variable. So, you've got the basic statistical methods that we look at, so association studies, correlations, enrichment analysis, regressions. But what we're now shifting to really is machine learning methods and AI-driven methods. We've got this huge amount of data, and it's very difficult to actually integrate it and make sense of it. So this review was all about the different kinds of machine learning and AI algorithms that are available and how they can be used to understand diseases such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, which are quite complex. And I guess one of the main challenges that we always have in psychiatric genetics is how do we use all this information to bring it back to the patient, bringing it back to identify drugs, targets for drugs, but also medicine, precision medicine, targeted treatment that work for people, so individualized therapies, etc. And I'm just going to give you a quick snippet without getting too much into detail, but these are some of the studies that we have established. Most of these are established in our group, but some of these are also in collaboration with our national and international collaborators. So we've got data on a whole range of different populations. So we've got children and birth cohort, we've got university students, we've got data from a suburb in Atlanta, which has highly high rates of trauma and stress. We've got data from pregnant women. We've recently got information from indigenous communities, which has just been funded. As Kerrie and Paul mentioned, we are also looking at elite athletes, emergency responders, as well as veterans. So this is a huge amount of data, not just genetics data, but also psychosocial data, health data, clinical data. It's a lot of information that we need to look at and understand. I'm just quickly going to go through a couple of the projects that are sports related. So on the left, this is a project where we're looking at elite athletes at QUT, and we're looking at them at 2 different time points and collecting DNA, but also health data, and trying to understand what are the drivers of health and performance in the athletes. On the right, this is a project together with the industry partner Precision Health Alliance. And so PHA has a very interesting mobile app where you can take a photograph of yourself and it calculates all the different dimensions. It integrates that with the psychosocial information that you fill out using the online survey data. And then using all of this, it looks at its own database, which is driven through an AI algorithm. And what it gives at the end is personalized markers for your diet. So what works best for you, what sleep pattern works best for you, what exercise regimens would work best for you. So it kind of really gives you this personalized health kind of report, in fact. So just kind of wrapping this all up, psychiatry is really complex. Our brain is really complex. And one of the really, important things here is how to make sense of this huge amount of data that we have. And in psychiatry, we've been using a lot of the traditional methods, but now the field is really moving towards better methods, machine-driven algorithms, AI-driven algorithms, data from a whole range of different sources like social media, wearables, health records, and really trying to understand how this data can be used for improving patient health and well-being. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Divya. That was great. It's really interesting to be able to sort of understand a little bit, just a tiny little bit, about what's happening in this very complex system that we have in our brains. So, so now we come to our Q&A session. And if anybody has any questions, then please pop them into the Q&A box, and we may be able to get to them. We just have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to start with you, Divya, because I'm following on from your talk. And just ask, in terms of data in psychiatric genetics research, what's one thing that's working well, and what's one thing that's not working so well or could be improved?
Thanks, Kerrie. So I think the one thing that's working quite well in psychiatric genetics research is the collaborative spirit that we have. So in psychiatry, there's a lot of large consortia that have been formed, and most of us are part of it. And through these consortia, what we can do is get access to other data sets, which means instead of all of us working in our silos, we're actually working collaboratively as a team. So I think that's been really great in the field of psychiatric genetics. One thing that's not been working really well is there are no specific guidelines in psychiatry for collection of data. So this includes not just clinical data. So people measure depression, for example, using different scales and different methods, which makes it very difficult to standardize results and outcomes across studies. And obviously, with this huge amount of data, one of the other issue is the integration of data. So the methods that we're using are mostly traditional and outdated. And now I think with the, kind of a use of machine learning as well as AI-driven algorithms, hopefully we can overcome some of these limitations that we've had in integrating the data.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. Brodie, I'm going to turn to you now, and I'm going to ask a question about you talking about generating data in order to be able to answer some of the questions that are of interest. How does the research you've discussed compare with like the generative AI that we've been seeing more and more of these days?
Yeah, and it's getting really good too, I think, is the first thing to say, because there's been the boom that people will be familiar with, and it's sort of had this explosion. And a lot of that has come from training on lots and lots of data. And so especially sort of pre the latest boom where you can interact with these models, with plain text and they will do things for you. Um, I would say the big difference was the amount of training data that was needed. Um, the way that when you get in there and you get your hands a bit more dirty and you come up with bespoke methods, like we just had one pattern and we would try and copy that pattern. And so we have a method that learns a pattern, but it's using one pattern. It's not trying to see so much histology from so many people that we don't have. But I guess in the most modern times now, you can probably give these types of models a pattern and say, well, can you recreate this pattern? And you will get something that looks visually quite good. I mean, we've all seen AI generated images and what level that's at now. So I'd say the difference there is then about how much control you want over things. And so because we have a bespoke thing, we could say, well, let's make it a bit more dense, but the same kind of patterning. So there's more blockage there, but in the same kind of arrangements. So I guess the difference is the AI might actually get you a lot of the way there now with pattern generation, these kind of things. But if you want that extra control or you want interpretable parameters that you can give to a practitioner, that's where you may still get an advantage from the bespoke stuff. Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah. And a great explanation of the difference. So thank you. Kate, I'm going to ask you a question. So you talked about extreme science in the Antarctic and how this translates to like extreme data science. But I can imagine that in your area too, this also translates to extremely large transdisciplinary collaborations. So from the perspective of a mathematician or a data scientist, what are some of the benefits and the challenges of working with such diverse groups as opposed to working in your own field by yourself?
Yeah, you're totally right, Kerrie. So to do what we want to do, which is real management of real systems, we have to work in interdisciplinary teams. And I'm a chief investigator, as are you, Kerrie, on the Securing Antarctica's Environmental Future, which is an ARC, a big ARC centre where we have geologists and ecologists and biologists and social scientists, all these different types of people, all coming at problems from the same directions. And we all work towards the same goals, but it's really hard. Interdisciplinary science is hard because you're all speaking different languages. You all want to get to the same place, but just those early communications are really hard. One thing that we've found is like once you hit a stride in that type of communication, it doesn't stop being hard, but you can overcome some of those communication barriers a little bit easier because you've built those really solid relationships. And the end goal is so much better, right? Like what we want to be doing is the best possible, most exciting mathematics and data science with the best and newest data. The way to do that is to work with the people who know about that best possible data. And then what we want to do is sort of inform real management of these real systems. And to do that, you need to be collaborating with the end user stakeholders as key parts of that project team. So we work really closely with people from the Australian government, for example, who are the ones who really can tell us we do need to know these types of things in order to manage these systems. This type of information would be really helpful in those intergovernmental discussions. And then we get to take that and do our work in a really kind of applied and focused way. So we can say, this is the question that has to get answered. And so it's a trickier journey. It's a longer journey, but the end outcome, I think, if you want to make real impact, it's the only way to do it. And it ends up being its own very incredibly satisfying journey.
Thank you. Yeah. So I agree, and you've articulated it very well. So thank you, Kate. Paul and Aiden, I'm going to ask you to do a bit of future gazing now. And I'm going to ask each of you about directions for data science and AI. So Paul, over to you first. So what are some exciting directions, future directions for data science and AI in elite sports?
Actually, echoing some of the earlier comments about in some ways that we have not much data, but also a really strong need to personalize the data. And that absolutely applies in elite sports, but also for community, right? I cannot possibly run like Usain Bolt, but I would love to have access to the science and the technology that he has. And so this is where the kind of modern methods and innovations of those in data science and AI capturing the uncertainty to bring together all the different snippets of data, whether it's medical data, like from injuries, performance data, like from wearable sensors, video data. I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but computer vision is making leaps and bounds. But now the apps have started to come out to allow you and I to do this too. So I think this is a very exciting area to kind of bring together this data. What can we actually make out of it? What is the uncertainty around it? And then using that to improve training, fitness, performance, and avoiding, hopefully, or recovering from injuries.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting and something really to be looking forward to from both the sports perspective and from the data science perspective. So Aiden, a similar question for you. So what are some of the more extreme types of data that you're seeing on the horizon, and how do you think they're going to help us to understand some of the links that you're interested in, for example, between the environment and our health?
Yeah, I think there's a good amount of emerging tech, especially around AI. But I think one of the other cool things that's changing in the data science landscape is around just openness of data sharing and accessibility. And now that people have kind of got the concepts behind data sharing and data structures down, there's a lot more access to data that's emerging in data systems. So I'm thinking things like better access to satellite imagery, access to these data sets previously behind really expensive lock and key, like mobility data, mobile phone like users and their like travel across regions. Emerging national service accessibility data. For example, the data I've spent a lot of time compiling that's held by data custodians, but very pricey to access, and conversations are now happening to enable that to be wider and cheaper or even free access for researchers. Other areas that are previously completely commercial, like power outage data, there's discussions around releasing that. And you can imagine even just those that I've mentioned, the combination of those different types of data, just how impactful that would be on the kinds of modeling and things that we can achieve. But then there's technological adaptation. There's things like crowdsourced data, citizen science data becoming, I guess, more used by communities. I'm thinking things like crowdsourced flood data, for example, that could inform how we run our models or update our models. There's better access to real-time tech. For example, flood sensors that can be installed in storm drains to give an idea of water height. And all of these things, I think, in terms of technology, can combine to form, for example, alert support systems that can give alerts to communities. And that's when I think things like generative AI can really step in, because you've got cold communities, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, who can really benefit from these alerts that are translated to different languages or for different communities. And one other thing I think is to shout out some of the comments that Kate was making around cross-disciplinary collaboration. I think there's a big thing in the space looking at cross-disciplinary work is emerging research, that there's all of this emerging technology. And because it's emerging and changing so quickly, and especially data access, now there's leaps and bounds in just research that's coming out. There's so much information to kind of get through that's coming out, and being able to leverage those research findings in other work is also very, very valuable.
Yeah, thank you, Aiden. It's exciting times, and it's a great answer. So we're almost now at the end of our time, and it's been a great discussion from our 5 speakers, touching on extreme science related to the environment, such as the Antarctic, our health, such as understanding our hearts and our brains, agriculture, such as crop growth, and social systems, such as sport, and extreme data, extreme mathematics, and extreme data science. So to all of you, you all work in such interesting areas, and I'd like to ask each of you just very quickly, what's one 10-word message you would give to the aspiring mathematicians and data scientists listening today? So, Divya.
As a geneticist, I would like to say every gene tells a story and data science writes its translation.
Perfect. Thank you. Brodie.
Yeah, I'd just highlight problem solving and the fun in that, and slightly more than 10 words, just to highlight what Kate said before, where you often need to bring existing tools and then tinker with them to solve the problem. And I think that's where the fun is. And yeah, it
Great.
might be more fun than you expect. That's all I'll say.
That's great. Kate.
I think everyone loves maths and data science, but you can also find a thing that you care about and really try and move a needle on that and really contribute to that using these methods that you really love. So find that thing that you want to work on.
Great. Paul.
Stats brings people together to solve real problems. Never give up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And Aiden.
My journey in data science is all about solving problems. So I'd just say that there are so many open problems to solve, and there are so many diverse skill sets that can be applied to those problems, and it's very rewarding.
Thank you. They're great messages, and we look forward to the next generation of mathematicians and data scientists from all areas working, and scientists working with data and being able to really address some of the challenges of our time. So now we really are out of time. And so thank you again to the 5 panellists, to the organisers, and to the hosts, the Centre for Data Science and the Queensland Academy of the Arts and Sciences. A recording of the webinar will be available on the CDS website soon, and we'll let you know about that on our LinkedIn page for the Centre for Data Science as soon as that happens. A final thank you to you, our audience. We hope that you've enjoyed this discussion as much as we have. So see you next time. Bye.